For decades, Josef Stalin was venerated as the great architect of the Soviet victory over Nazism. His portraits hung in squares, factories and schools, presenting him as an infallible leader, almost a protective father of the homeland. But behind the official image lies a much darker truth, a story marked by terror, blood and the suffering of millions of innocents. Stalin did not only rule with an iron fist, he created a system of fear in which no one was safe. Neither peasants nor soldiers, nor even those closest to his circle of power. Under his command, massive purges were carried out, famines were provoked, an empire of forced labor camps was built, and relentless surveillance was established that turned daily life into a nightmare. This is not the story of a hero, nor that of a brilliant strategist, but that of a dictator who led his people to military victory, while at the same time condemning them to indescribable suffering. This is the story of the darkest side of Josef Stalin. The darkest side of Josef Stalin, difficult to see. Josef Stalin is remembered in history as the man who transformed the Soviet Union from an agrarian and fragmented country into an industrial and military power capable of challenging the entire world, and as the leader who played a decisive role in the defeat of Adolf Hitler during the Second World War. However, behind this image of triumph and leadership lies a much darker and more terrifying background. The figure of Stalin embodies one of the most brutal dictatorships of the 20th century, a regime characterized by the absolute control of the state over all aspects of the lives of its citizens and by the systematic implementation of a terror that penetrated every corner of Soviet society. Since he assumed power after the death of Lenin, Stalin set in motion a process of political consolidation that combined strategic cunning and brutal repression. The 30s were marked by the Great Purges, where millions of people were arrested, deported to labor camps, or executed without fair trial. Intellectuals, soldiers, peasants, workers, and any person considered a threat to the power of the Communist Party could be dragged into the abyss of persecution. Fear became a central tool of his government. Denunciation, constant surveillance, and suspicion were daily elements that shaped the lives of millions of Soviets. Terror was not limited to direct political repression. Stalin also implemented economic and social policies that claimed millions of lives. The forced collectivization of agriculture caused devastating famines, especially in Ukraine, where the so-called Holodomor left between 3 and 5 million dead. The mass deportations of entire ethnic groups, such as the Chechens, Crimean Tatars, or Soviet Poles, reflected a ruthless calculation. Any community considered disloyal to the regime had to be eliminated or relocated, regardless of the human consequences. During the Second World War, Stalin showed a facet of strategic and determined leadership, managing to mobilize resources and population to resist and finally defeat the Nazi machinery. However, even in times of war, his paranoia did not diminish. Hundreds of officers of the Red Army were executed or sent to forced labor camps under suspicions of treason, and millions of citizens lived under the constant threat of reprisals for the slightest suspicion of disloyalty. The combination of his political cunning with boundless cruelty consolidated his absolute control over the Soviet Union, transforming the country into a state where human life could be sacrificed at the whim of the leader. The legacy of Stalin is therefore profoundly contradictory. On one hand, he managed to industrialize the Soviet Union, strengthen its army, and turn it into a superpower capable of challenging the West. On the other hand, he left a country marked by fear, distrust, and systematic violence. Millions of Soviets died as a direct result of his policies, and entire generations grew up in an environment where terror was daily and freedom was subordinated to the state. The history of Stalin cannot be understood solely from his military or economic achievements. The darkest side of his government lies in the way he used absolute power to dominate, punish, and terrorize his people, leaving an indelible mark on the collective memory of the Soviet Union and of the entire world. The young revolutionary who dreamed of absolute power. Josef Stalin was not born in a palace nor in a family of power. His origin was humble and marked by adversity. His story begins on the 18th of December of 1878 in Gori, a small city in Georgia, which at that time was part of the vast Russian Empire. His original name was Iosif Vissarionovich Djugashvili, and from his early years his life was far from privileges. He was a sickly child with fragile health, which made him face from an early age a harsh and demanding reality. His father, Bessarion Djougashvili, worked as a shoemaker and was known for his violent character and alcoholism. He often mistreated him physically and verbally, leaving deep scars in Josef's personality. His mother, Ketevan Geladze, was a deeply religious woman who saw in education the only way out for her son and dreamed that someday he would become a priest. To fulfill that dream, she enrolled him in the ecclesiastical school of Gori, a place that combined religious education with strict academic discipline. There, Stalin stood out for his intelligence and prodigious memory, showing from a young age a remarkable ability for study and information retention. However, a complex character was also evident in him, rebellious, proud, and with a growing resentment toward authority, which led him to clash with teachers and classmates. His religious education provided him with knowledge in literature, history, and Latin, but at the same time exposed him to a world of strict rules and dogmas that soon began to challenge his worldview. During his adolescence, young Djougashvili began to take an interest in political ideas that defied the established order. In the seminary of Tiflis, while studying theology, he had access to forbidden materials and moved among circles of young people who discussed politics and revolution. It was there that he came into contact with the writings of Karl Marx and the works of Vladimir Lenin, as well as with revolutionary pamphlets that circulated clandestinely. These texts sowed in him an early conviction that social change was only possible through the struggle against the existing structures of power. In secret, he studied theories about class struggle, socialism, and the necessity of revolution, forming the first foundations of what would later become his political ideology. At the end of the 19th century, the revolutionary atmosphere that swept across the Caucasus and Tsarist Russia decisively influenced his youth. Stalin abandoned the religious path and began to participate actively in Marxist and social democratic groups, becoming involved in clandestine activities that included organizing strikes, distributing forbidden literature, and planning attacks against representatives of the Tsarist regime. This stage of his life was marked by the constant risk of arrest. The political police of the Russian Empire closely monitored the young revolutionary who dreamed of absolute power. Josef Stalin was not born in a palace nor in a family of power. His origin was humble and marked by adversity. His story begins on the 18th of December of 1878 in Gori, a small city in Georgia, which at that time was part of the vast Russian Empire. His original name was Josef Vissarionovich Djougashvili, and from his early years his life was far from privileges. He was a sickly child with fragile health, which made him face from an early age a harsh and demanding reality. His father, Bessarion Djougashvili, worked as a shoemaker and was known for his violent character and alcoholism. He often mistreated him physically and verbally, leaving deep scars in Josef's personality. His mother, Ketevan Geladze, was a deeply religious woman who saw in education the only way out for her son and dreamed that someday he would become a priest. To fulfill that dream, she enrolled him in the ecclesiastical school of Gori, a place that combined religious education with strict academic discipline. There, Stalin stood out for his intelligence and prodigious memory, showing from a young age a remarkable ability for study and information retention. However, a complex character was also evident in him, rebellious, proud, and with a growing resentment toward authority, which led him to clash with teachers and classmates. His religious education provided him with knowledge in literature, history, and Latin, but at the same time exposed him to a world of strict rules and dogmas that soon began to challenge his worldview. During his adolescence, young Djougashvili began to take an interest in political ideas that defied the established order. In the seminary of Tiflis, while studying theology, he had access to forbidden materials and moved among circles of young people who discussed politics and revolution. It was there that he came into contact with the writings of Karl Marx and the works of Vladimir Lenin, as well as with revolutionary pamphlets that circulated clandestinely. These texts sowed in him an early conviction that social change was only possible through the struggle against the existing structures of power. In secret, he studied theories about class struggle, socialism, and the necessity of revolution, forming the first foundations of what would later become his political ideology. At the end of the 19th century, the revolutionary atmosphere that swept across the Caucasus and Tsarist Russia decisively influenced his youth. Stalin abandoned the religious path and began to participate actively in Marxist and social democratic groups, becoming involved in clandestine activities that included organizing strikes, distributing forbidden literature, and planning attacks against representatives of the Tsarist regime. This stage of his life was marked by the constant risk of arrest. The political police of the Russian Empire closely monitored young revolutionaries, and Stalin suffered his first arrests and internal exiles, experiences that consolidated his resilient character, his capacity for strategy, and his will to power. Although his name was not yet known outside Georgian revolutionary circles, these youthful experiences shaped the man who decades later would dominate the Soviet Union with an iron hand. His childhood of poverty, his truncated religious education, his father's abuse, and his early exposure to political repression created a unique combination of intelligence, ambition, and hardness that would define his character and his methods as a leader. What seemed to be a young man marked by fragility and rebellion ended up becoming one of the most influential and feared dictators of the 20th century, whose life and decisions would radically transform the fate of millions of people. Stalin became a prominent activist of the Bolshevik movement, immersed in a network of revolutionaries who sought to overthrow the Tsarist regime and transform 19th century Russia into a socialist society. From his first steps in the underground, from Lenin's ally to the master of the Kremlin. When Vladimir Lenin passed away in January of 1924, the Soviet Union was going through one of its most critical moments. The Civil War had left the country devastated. Destroyed cities, ruined factories, abandoned fields, and millions of lost lives. The economy was on the brink of collapse, with agricultural production barely sufficient to feed the population and an almost non-existent industry after years of conflict. But beyond the material damage, the Bolshevik Party faced deep internal divisions. The figure of Lenin had been a unifying factor, and without his leadership, the central question was not only who would take power, but also what direction the revolutionary project he had initiated would take. In this context, Josef Stalin emerged as a previously discreet figure within the Central Committee. Although close to Lenin and loyal during the Civil War, he lacked the prestige of leaders such as Trotsky, a military genius and theorist of the Red Army, Bukharin, influential in economic theory, and Zinoviev and Kamenev, with solid networks within the party. Stalin, perceived as pragmatic and administrative without ideological ambitions, was underestimated, which would become his main advantage. The position of General Secretary, which Stalin had assumed in 1922, was apparently a minor bureaucratic post responsible for the internal organization of the party and the management of appointments and dismissals within the Soviet apparatus. However, Stalin understood that this administrative power gave him the key to real control. He could place allies in strategic positions, isolate rivals, control the flow of information, and determine who rose or fell within the Communist Party. While other leaders focused on ideological debates or personal prestige, Stalin worked meticulously behind the scenes, building a network of loyalties that gradually became the foundation of his rise to absolute power. Lenin's death precipitated an open struggle for party leadership. Trotsky defended the theory of permanent revolution, the idea that the survival of Soviet socialism depended on extending the revolution to other countries, especially Germany and Central Europe, to ensure a favorable international environment. Stalin, on the contrary, promoted the idea of socialism in one country, arguing that the Soviet Union must first consolidate its own system and strengthen the state internally before intervening abroad. For a country exhausted after years of war and famine, this pragmatic and seemingly sensible proposal proved more attractive to many party leaders and to the general population. Stalin's rise was a calculated process of temporary alliances and strategic betrayals. Initially, he allied himself with Zinoviev and Kamenev to isolate and weaken Trotsky, using his influence in the party and regional committees to defame him and accuse him of factionalism, while expanding his own network of bureaucratic support. Once Trotsky was marginalized and finally expelled from the party in 1927, Stalin turned against his former allies. He allied with Bukharin and other moderate leaders to consolidate his control over economic and social policy, selectively promoting policies such as the New Economic Policy, while preparing the ground for his absolute rise. When he no longer needed his temporary allies, he also removed them from power through internal purges, political marginalization, and in many cases, subsequent execution or imprisonment. The fall of Trotsky was emblematic of this struggle. Despite having been one of the architects of the Bolshevik victory in the Civil War and a brilliant strategist, he was discredited, exiled, and finally assassinated in Mexico in 1940 by an agent sent by Stalin. His defeat symbolized how political cunning, patience, and bureaucratic control could surpass even military talent and revolutionary prestige. In that process, Stalin demonstrated his ability to manipulate party institutions, exploit his rivals' weaknesses, and transform an apparently administrative position into the foundation of absolute power that would allow him to shape the Soviet Union according to his vision. In short, the struggle for Lenin's succession was not only a confrontation of ideas, but also a clash of strategies, cunning, and personal ambitions. Stalin, underestimated by many at the beginning, emerged as the architect of modern Soviet power, combining pragmatism, political calculation, and cold patience that allowed him to surpass more visible and brilliant rivals, thus establishing the foundations of the dictatorship that would mark the history of the 20th century. In 1929, Leon Trotsky, Stalin's main rival, was exiled from the USSR and years later assassinated in Mexico by an agent sent by Stalin. Other leaders of the old Bolshevik Guard, such as Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin, also faced dismissal, imprisonment, exile, or execution, eliminating Lenin's original circle and allowing Stalin to concentrate unprecedented power. This process combined politics and propaganda. Stalin presented himself as the natural continuer of Lenin's legacy through joint portraits, parades, ceremonies, and the display of Lenin's embalmed body in Red Square, consolidating his image as protector of the revolution and unquestionable guardian of Soviet power. At the same time, Stalin worked with meticulous strategy in building a network of personal loyalties within the party and the state. Officials, bureaucrats, and army officers owed their rise to his direct will, which made them absolutely dependent on his power and ensured that any organized opposition was practically neutralized. This system of clientelism, combined with the fear that was already beginning to spread, ensured that any internal dissent was stifled before becoming a real threat. The machinery of purges, accusations, and selective dismissals was effectively set in motion, creating an environment where silence and obedience were the only safe ways to survive within the apparatus of the state. In less than 1 decade, the discreet Bolshevik of the early years transformed into the absolute master of the Kremlin and, with that, of the Soviet Union. His apparent mediocrity, his administrative profile, and his low public visibility had been essential tools. While other leaders became entangled in open ideological debates, Stalin acted in silence, weaving strategic alliances, accumulating power, and eliminating his rivals with patience and calculated precision. The combination of political cunning, manipulation of bureaucracy, and absolute control over the party made him an indisputable leader. When his adversaries finally tried to react, it was already too late. The structure of power was firmly in his hands, and any attempt at resistance encountered a system of surveillance, repression, and internal discipline that he himself had built. Thus, the man who initially seemed a grey and subordinate administrator, a secondary actor in the ideological struggle of the revolution, emerged as the absolute dictator. The transformation of Stalin was, in essence, that of a patient and ruthless strategist who turned discretion into his greatest weapon, ensuring that the destiny of millions of Soviets remained under his total control, and establishing the foundations of a regime that would mark the 20th century with its power, its violence, and its omnipresence. The Great Terror, purges, trials, and mass executions. The Great Terror was not limited to public trials or to high-ranking figures of the Communist Party. Its reach was much broader and more devastating. Officers of the Red Army were arrested, accused of treason, and executed, which seriously weakened the Soviet military structure just before the Second World War. Local officials, peasants, intellectuals, teachers, and ordinary citizens also became victims of Stalinist paranoia. Anonymous denunciations, neighborhood reports, or simple rumors could be enough to trigger arrests, deportations, or executions by firing squad. The repression quotas were imposed from Moscow, and the regions competed to demonstrate loyalty by sending more people to prison or to forced labor camps. The concentration camps, known as gulags, filled with political prisoners, dissidents, and enemies of the people. Their conditions were extreme. Endless workdays, scarce food, extreme cold, and daily violence turned survival into a matter of pure physical endurance and luck. The civilian population lived under the constant fear that any word, gesture, or relationship could be interpreted as treason. Families were separated, children grew up without their parents, and mutual distrust became a feature of daily life, affecting personal, work, and social relationships for years. Stalin personally supervised these purges, dictating lists of targets and reviewing reports from the NKVD. The machinery of terror was carefully organized. Each arrest and each execution was recorded, documented, and used as an example to instill fear. The regime's propaganda justified these actions as a defense of socialism and state security, presenting the enemies as ruthless traitors conspiring with foreign powers to destroy the Soviet Union. In practice, this allowed the elimination of rivals, the consolidation of officials' loyalty, and the maintenance of absolute control over society. The impact of the Great Terror was deep and lasting. Social cohesion was fractured. The political apparatus became more dependent on the dictator, and the culture of fear became internalized in the population. Historically, these purges destroyed generations of revolutionary leaders, intellectuals, and professionals, leaving a void that shaped the USSR for decades. The wounds of the Great Terror not only affected the survivors, but also permeated the collective memory of the country, turning Stalin into a feared and omnipresent figure whose power was based as much on force as on the ability to terrorize an entire people. The impact of Stalin's purges on the Red Army was deep and long-lasting. The systematic elimination of high command did not only affect the most prominent generals, but also caused a vacuum of experience and tactical leadership that seriously weakened the Soviet Army's operational capacity. Mid-level officers, trainers, instructors, and logistics personnel were arrested or executed, leaving units without guidance or cohesion. The atmosphere of distrust extended to the lowest levels. Soldiers did not know whom they could trust, and blind obedience became the only way to survive. The case of Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky is paradigmatic. Considered a military reformer and pioneer in mechanized warfare strategy, Tukhachevsky was accused of conspiring with foreign powers, an absurd charge but sufficient to justify his execution. His death, together with that of 6 of the 8 highest-ranking marshals and hundreds of generals, eliminated the military minds that could have effectively defended the Soviet Union against a foreign invasion. The trials against these officers were public performances filled with theatricality, with confessions obtained through torture and coercion. The regime's propaganda justified the executions by claiming that the accused planned to betray the country, but in reality they were tools for Stalin to consolidate absolute control over the army and the state. The effect on civil society was also devastating. Paranoia spread beyond the centers of power. Peasants, workers, and professionals were arrested under suspicions of counter-revolutionary activity or of links with external enemies. Entire families were deported to inhospitable regions, condemned to forced labor, and exposed to extreme conditions that often proved fatal. The gulags became centers of massive suffering, where hunger, cold, and violence were daily routines, and survival depended as much on physical strength as on the ability to adapt to a brutal and unpredictable system. This systematic terror also had a psychological effect that endured for generations. Distrust became a social norm. No one could fully trust friends, neighbors, or even family members. Every interaction was loaded with tension, and the internal surveillance of society reinforced Stalin's power, ensuring that any trace of disobedience or criticism was stifled before taking shape. The combination of political purges, military persecution, and total social control created a state in which loyalty could not be demonstrated genuinely. Only absolute submission guaranteed survival. Altogether, the purges of the 1930s not only eliminated Stalin's perceived enemies, but also left the Soviet Union vulnerable at critical moments, shaped the country's political culture, and cemented a regime of terror that would continue for decades after his death. The elimination of experienced leaders and the establishment of constant fear consolidated Stalin as a dictator whose power depended not only on formal authority, but also on the ability to sow terror in every corner of the state and society. The impact of these purges and deportations was devastating on multiple levels. The elimination of military command, along with the repression of administrative and professional cadres, left the Soviet Union extremely vulnerable in the years preceding the Second World War. The loss of experienced officers, trainers, instructors and strategists meant that when the Wehrmacht launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941, many units lacked leadership capable of coordinating effective defenses, which contributed to the enormous initial defeats and the capture of millions of Soviet soldiers. The campaigns against ethnic minorities had a double purpose: to consolidate territorial control and eliminate any element considered politically unreliable. Entire communities were uprooted from their traditional regions. The Poles in Ukraine and Belarus, the Volga Germans, the Crimean Tatars, the Koreans in the Far East, and the Finns were transported under extreme conditions. The train journeys were endless, the food insufficient, and diseases spread rapidly. Upon arrival at their destinations, the deportees faced extreme climates, forced labor in mining, construction, and agriculture, and the constant threat of violence from the guards. Thousands died along the way or during the first months of settlement. The communities that for generations had developed their own traditions, languages, and ways of life were fragmented and subjected to processes of forced assimilation, losing cultural identities and family ties. The judicial apparatus was completely subordinated to Stalin's will. The courts were no longer spaces of justice. Their main function was to ensure that the leaders' political decisions were executed without question. The trials were stagings where the accused, subjected to violent interrogations, had to confess to crimes they had not committed. Torture was not only physical but also psychological: prolonged isolation, threats to family members, sleep deprivation, and constant manipulation of information. Under these conditions, most of the accused ended up admitting any charge, even the most absurd, only to survive, although often the confession did not prevent execution or transfer to the gulags. The system of repression extended to all areas of life. Schools, factories, universities, and the media were under constant surveillance. Propaganda reinforced the narrative that any suspect represented a mortal danger to the homeland, thus legitimizing mass arrests and deportations. Denunciation became a common practice as neighbors, colleagues, and family members could denounce each other, sometimes out of fear, other times out of ambition or revenge. This generated a society permeated by distrust, where personal relationships were based on caution and blind obedience to the regime. Altogether, these policies reflected Stalin's obsession with absolute control. It was not only about eliminating adversaries or protecting the state, it was a systematic mechanism to shape society in his image, ensure that no one questioned his authority, and guarantee that power remained concentrated in his hands. Terror, deportations, and the corruption of the judicial system not only destroyed lives but left lasting scars on the collective memory of the Soviet Union, creating a legacy of fear, distrust, and subordination that would endure long after the dictator's death. The Great Terror was not only an episode of massive violence, but also a phenomenon that radically transformed the social, political, and cultural structure of the Soviet Union. The magnitude of the purges produced a paralyzing effect in all areas of life. Public administration, the army, universities, the media, and cultural institutions became permanently subordinated to state control. Obedience was no longer just a political obligation, but a condition for survival. Any sign of discontent, criticism, or autonomy could be interpreted as treason, and the consequences were immediate and lethal. Public trials, known as the Moscow trials, became tools of propaganda and fear. Confessions extracted through physical and psychological torture were presented as irrefutable evidence of fantastic conspiracies involving espionage, sabotage, and treason against the regime. The accused, often former comrades of Lenin or heroes of the revolution, were forced to incriminate others, creating a circle of fear and suspicion that extended throughout society. This mechanism ensured that no one could be sure of their own loyalty or that of their colleagues, friends, or relatives, reinforcing the idea that the state absolutely controlled every aspect of individual life. The repression also had a devastating impact on the economy and production. Skilled officials, engineers, technicians, and scientists were arrested or executed, creating voids that delayed industrial and technological projects. In the countryside, collectivization had already caused hunger and resistance. The Great Terror deepened the disorganization by eliminating local leaders and agricultural supervisors, further weakening the country's productive capacity. The Red Army, weakened by the purge of its officers, was left exposed and ill-prepared to face the imminent Nazi threat, paying a high price in the first weeks of the German invasion. The gulags, which multiplied during this period, became a central element of Stalin's repressive policy. Beyond being prisons, they functioned as centers of economic exploitation. Prisoners worked in mines, railroad construction, logging, and other extreme tasks under inhuman conditions. Mortality was extremely high due to overwork, malnutrition, cold, and the violence of the guards. For many, the gulags represented a hopeless sentence, where mere daily existence was a battle for survival. Culturally, the Great Terror broke community and family ties. Distrust became the norm. Neighbors denounced neighbors, friends denounced friends, and the fear of being labeled as an enemy of the people became a constant that conditioned every human relationship. Children grew up learning to remain silent and to obey without question, and the collective memory was permeated by traumas that affected entire generations. Ultimately, the Great Terror not only physically eliminated millions of people, it also destroyed social structures, weakened the economy, and left deep psychological scars throughout the Soviet population. The combination of summary executions, mass deportations, and constant surveillance established a regime of terror that consolidated Stalin's absolute power and shaped the life of the Soviet Union for decades, leaving a legacy of fear, submission, and trauma that would endure long after the dictator's fall. As Stalin, in the war, hero for some, executioner for others. When Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on the 22nd of June of 1941, Josef Stalin found himself in a situation that put the entire system he had built in check. Despite having signed in 1939 the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, with its secret protocols dividing Poland and the rest of Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, Hitler's betrayal struck him brutally. Reports from Soviet intelligence and warnings from foreign diplomats had anticipated the imminence of an attack, but Stalin, convinced that the Führer would not risk opening a second front while Great Britain resisted, dismissed these signs. When the invasion finally occurred, the Soviet dictator fell into a state of shock bordering on paralysis. For several days, he avoided giving direct orders, secluded himself in his residence in Kuntsevo, and even some of his collaborators feared he might resign from power. The lack of immediate reaction allowed the German army to advance with devastating speed. Within weeks, the forces of the Wehrmacht and its allies surrounded enormous contingents of the Red Army. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were taken prisoner in battles such as Minsk and Smolensk, and soon that figure rose to millions in what was one of the greatest military collapses in history. The civilian population also suffered the onslaught of the invasion. Burned villages, mass deportations, and executions marked the beginning of the war on Soviet territory. Large agricultural regions and key cities, such as Kiev, fell under Nazi control, leaving the USSR on the brink of collapse. However, after that first stage of confusion, Stalin reacted with a harshness that would define the course of the conflict. On the 3rd of July of 1941, in a speech broadcast by radio, he addressed the Soviet people for the first time since the invasion began, appealing to patriotism and to the memory of the Napoleonic Wars to call for a great patriotic war. It was a crucial change. The struggle was no longer presented solely as a defense of socialism, but as a national war for the survival of Russia against a foreign invader. This ideological shift allowed millions of peasants, workers, and ordinary citizens to join the resistance, even those who had previously been persecuted or distrusted the regime. At the strategic level, Stalin deployed drastic measures to sustain resistance. One of his most significant decisions was the massive relocation of Soviet industry. Entire factories were dismantled piece by piece and transported by train to the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia, far from the reach of German aviation. This titanic effort, carried out in just a few months, ensured that the Soviet Union could maintain a constant flow of weapons, tanks, planes, and ammunition, despite having lost much of its western territory. The human sacrifice was enormous, with workers laboring under extreme conditions and endless shifts. But the result was decisive. The Soviet production apparatus became one of the most powerful in the world during wartime. On the military front, Stalin assumed direct and strict control over operations. He appointed and dismissed commanders easily, punishing any sign of weakness with severity. The famous Order 227, issued in July of 1942, symbolized this harshness. Under the slogan, "Not a step back," it prohibited retreat without express authorization. To enforce this order, special detachments were created to shoot soldiers attempting to flee combat. Although ruthless, this policy sought to prevent the massive collapses that had characterized the first months of the invasion and to reinforce discipline in an army traumatized by initial defeats. At the same time, Stalin appealed to nationalism and collective sacrifice. The resistance in cities such as Leningrad, which endured a siege of almost 900 days, and Stalingrad, where one of the bloodiest battles in history was fought, became symbols of the Soviet capacity to endure the unimaginable. It was in this context that Stalin's figure, initially wavering and questioned, was consolidated as that of the supreme commander who led the war against Nazism, combining relentless repression with an appeal to patriotic unity that mobilized millions of citizens. The triumphant entry of the Red Army into Berlin consolidated Stalin as one of the great victors of the Second World War. The victory parade in Moscow, held in June of 1945, was conceived as a spectacle of power and glory. Thousands of soldiers marched through Red Square carrying the captured banners of the Wehrmacht, which were symbolically thrown at the feet of Lenin's mausoleum, where Stalin watched from above. In the eyes of millions of Soviets, it was the culmination of an immeasurable sacrifice. The Great Patriotic War had cost more than 26 million lives, both military and civilian, a price that no other nation had paid in such magnitude. The suffering, however, was transformed into an element of collective pride, channeled by propaganda that exalted the heroic resistance of the Soviet people under their leader's guidance. On the international stage, Stalin emerged as one of the three central figures of the New World Order, alongside Roosevelt and later Truman, and Churchill, later Attlee. The division of Europe into spheres of influence was a demonstration of Stalin's ability to combine military strength with diplomatic cunning. While the West celebrated the end of the war as a victory of democracy over fascism, Stalin was already ensuring that the countries liberated by the Red Army would fall under the control of communist regimes. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Eastern Germany were turned into satellites of Moscow, marking the beginning of the continent's division and the long ideological and military confrontation known as the Cold War. Within the Soviet Union, the end of the conflict did not bring the freedom many expected. On the contrary, Stalin further reinforced his power. Soldiers returning from the front were viewed with suspicion, especially those who had been in contact with the West. Many were sent to the gulags accused of espionage or treason. The country, devastated by war, faced hunger and destruction, but the regime's priority was to rebuild heavy industry and the military apparatus, ensuring Soviet supremacy against the United States and its allies. In that context, the Soviet nuclear program was also developed, its progress closely supervised by Stalin, aware that possession of the atomic bomb would be key to maintaining the balance of power in the post-war world. Propaganda did not diminish after victory, but reached even grander levels. Stalin was presented as the supreme genius of military strategy, the infallible leader who had led the people to glory. His image was associated with the red flag over the Reichstag and with every celebration of victory. Monuments, songs, and films reinforced the narrative of the father of the homeland and the great commander. However, that image concealed a state that remained repressive, where any hint of criticism could mean imprisonment or death. The paradox of the Stalinist regime became more evident than ever. While the world recognized him as one of the architects of Nazism's defeat, millions of Soviets continued living under a climate of terror, subjected to surveillance, censorship, and the constant threat of repression. After the victory, the Soviet Union emerged as one of the two great superpowers of the planet, but that position was built on foundations of blood, repression, and fear. Stalin, far from softening his regime after triumphing over Germany, hardened it even more. The war had granted him unprecedented prestige, but it had also allowed him to reinforce the most authoritarian practices of his government. Suspicion toward his own citizens reached an almost paranoid level. Soldiers who had fought on the Western Front, especially those who had had contact with the Allies or had been temporarily captured by the Nazis, were considered potential traitors. Many of them, upon returning home, did not find the welcome of a grateful country, but the train wagons that transported them to forced labor camps in Siberia. The same fate awaited thousands of Soviet prisoners of war liberated after Germany's defeat. Instead of being received as heroes for having survived captivity, Stalin accused them of having surrendered voluntarily and punished them with deportations and summary trials. This cruel policy reflected the mentality of a leader who did not conceive surrender as an honorable option and who preferred to sacrifice his people rather than accept the slightest display of weakness. Thus, the war, which for millions had been a struggle for national survival, also became an instrument to purge and discipline society. In Eastern Europe, liberation from Nazi rule was quickly replaced by the establishment of communist regimes dependent on Moscow. In countries such as Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Romania, the Soviets installed puppet governments, persecuted the opposition, and tightly controlled political life. The promise of free elections, agreed upon with the Allies at Yalta, became a farce. The Communists, backed by the Red Army, manipulated electoral processes and silenced any dissenting voice. The result was the creation of the so-called Iron Curtain, an ideological and political division that would separate Europe into two blocks for almost half a century. The figure of Stalin in the war was thus enveloped in a profound contradiction. For millions of Soviets and occupied Europeans, he was the man who stopped Hitler, who turned resistance into victory, and who raised the red flag over the ruins of Berlin. For others, he was the dictator who turned that victory into a new system of domination, where repression and fear were the main tools of government. The gulags remained full, censorship was relentless, and the secret police maintained strict control over any hint of opposition. Even internationally, Stalin's image was ambivalent. While in the West he was recognized as one of the architects of Nazism's defeat, suspicions about his expansionist intentions multiplied. His ability to impose his will in Eastern Europe, combined with the opacity of his regime, fueled the perception that the war had not truly ended, but had instead given rise to a new global confrontation. In that sense, Stalin's legacy during the war cannot be understood solely as that of a victorious commander, but also as that of a leader who used wartime tragedy to cement a system of total control. The shadow of the post-war period, repression and anti-Semitism. The Soviet post-war period was marked by a climate of permanent suspicion that permeated all aspects of social and political life. Although victory had turned Stalin into a leader venerated by broad sectors of the Soviet people, the consolidation of his power resulted in a resurgence of the repressive practices that had already characterized his regime in previous decades. The NKVD, later transformed into the MGB and later into the KGB, perfected its machinery of surveillance and control, infiltrating cultural, academic, and scientific institutions to detect any hint of dissent. Censorship reached suffocating levels. Books, films, scientific research, and even university lectures were examined under a magnifying glass, and any ideological deviation could become a sentence of ostracism, deportation, or death. The military, who had gained prestige during the Great Patriotic War, were not exempt from this repressive wave either. Decorated generals, marshals, and high-ranking officers were demoted or eliminated under accusations of conspiracy or bourgeois deviationism. Even figures such as Marshal Georgy Zhukov, architect of the victory in Berlin, were removed from power out of fear that their popularity represented a threat to Stalin's cult of personality. This dynamic showed how the dictator's paranoia was capable of turning war heroes into potential traitors. The anti-Semitic campaign of the late 1940s was one of the darkest episodes of this period. Stalin saw in Jewish communities and Jewish intellectual circles a bridge to the West, which, in the context of the emerging Cold War, was interpreted as a threat of infiltration and espionage. Jewish cultural organizations were shut down, Yiddish newspapers were banned, and community leaders were arrested on false charges. The Doctors' Conspiracy of 1952 to 1953 was the culmination of this trend. A group of doctors, mostly Jews, was accused of planning the assassination of high Soviet officials by poisoning. Although the evidence was non-existent and the trials were manipulated, the campaign generated a climate of terror and official anti-Semitism that spread throughout society. The persecution was not limited to this particular case. Many Jewish scientists and academics were expelled from their positions, and in fields such as medicine, physics, and literature, silent purges were carried out that deprived the USSR of important talents. This institutionalized anti-Semitism coincided with a time when the State of Israel, newly created in 1948, began to lean toward the Western orbit, which reinforced Stalin's distrust of Soviet Jews, whom he began to regard as a potential fifth column. Meanwhile, the propaganda apparatus continued to feed the cult of the leader's personality. Stalin was presented not only as the architect of victory over Hitler, but also as the supreme guide in times of peace, capable of leading the Soviet Union into a new era of greatness. Images of the dictator adorned factories, schools, and public squares. Songs, poems, and theatrical works exalted his supposed virtues. This ideological machinery served to conceal the daily repression and to reinforce the idea that any criticism was not an attack on the government, but a betrayal of the homeland itself. The Soviet post-war society, exhausted after more than 2 decades of political violence and years of total war, was trapped in a paradox. It had defeated Nazism, but remained subjected to a regime that used the same tools of terror, control, and persecution to perpetuate itself in power. The Soviet post-war period was marked not only by the reconstruction of a country devastated by years of conflict, but also by the deepening of a system of absolute control that transformed the daily life of millions of people into a constant exercise of surveillance and fear. Repression extended to all levels of the state and society. Officials, workers, intellectuals, and peasants could be arrested for suspicions of disloyalty or for thoughts contrary to the official line. Trials were summary, sentences arbitrary, and executions secret, turning legality into a tool at the service of the regime's paranoia. In the territories annexed or liberated during the war, the pattern was repeated with equal or greater harshness. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany were subjected to a process of forced Sovietization. Local communist parties, supported by the presence of the Red Army, systematically eliminated independent leaders, critical intellectuals, political opponents, and national activists who could question Moscow's authority. The political purges were not limited to the military or bureaucratic spheres, but also reached writers, artists, and academics, whose work had to strictly conform to the canons of socialist realism and to the cult of Stalin's personality. The Jewish population within the USSR was the victim of systematic policies of discrimination. During the post-war period, the exclusion of Jews from strategic positions in government, industry, education, and the armed forces intensified. Universities and cultural centers experienced mass expulsions, and the media disseminated narratives linking Jewish identity with treason, conspiracy, or foreign influence. This campaign not only limited professional and educational opportunities, but also fostered a climate of suspicion and hostility within society itself, where neighbors, colleagues, and family members could become informants. Daily life was permeated by absolute social control. The secret police maintained constant surveillance, telephones and correspondence were intercepted, and informing became an almost obligatory practice to demonstrate loyalty to the regime. Entire families were separated or deported to remote regions of the country, and generations grew up with the latent fear that any comment or action could be considered treason. Children from school onward received political education that glorified the figure of Stalin and demonized any form of dissent, consolidating a cycle of obedience and self-censorship that lasted for decades. This period revealed the darkest side of Stalin, a leader who, after having led the Soviet Union to victory over Hitler, used that prestige to strengthen his internal control and perpetuate a system of terror. It was not only about maintaining political power, but also about shaping the entire society according to a model of unbreakable loyalty and constant repression. Discriminatory policies, omnipresent surveillance, and the violent repression of any cultural or political autonomy left a deep mark not only on the USSR, but also on the way communist regimes were consolidated throughout Eastern Europe. The post-war period, which could have been a time of reconstruction and hope, was transformed into decades of institutionalized fear, mutual distrust, and the restriction of fundamental freedoms, ensuring that Stalin's shadow remained over his country and over the continent long after his death. The end of the dictator, death, paranoia, and bloody legacy. The decline of Josef Stalin did not arrive suddenly. It was the result of decades of consolidating an absolute power that transformed the Soviet Union into a state feared not only by foreign powers but also by its own citizens. Throughout the years, Stalin turned the country into a machine of total control, where surveillance, denunciation, and fear became tools of government as powerful as the army or the state bureaucracy. The paranoia that characterized his final years did not arise overnight. It was the outcome of a life dedicated to eliminating any real or perceived threat, where trust had become an impossible luxury, even for those around him. During this period, his health deteriorated notably. The dictator suffered from hypertension, atherosclerosis, and complications derived from coronary arteriosclerosis, accumulated after decades of excessive work, constant stress, and an obsessive lifestyle centered on power. The combination of these illnesses with years of political pressure made him more irritable, volatile, and above all, even more distrustful. Despite his physical condition, Stalin continued to intervene actively in both internal and external politics. He reviewed security documents, personally supervised ongoing purges, and dictated new repressive policies against those he considered enemies of the people. Censorship intensified, arrests and executions continued, and surveillance over intellectuals, military officers, and members of the Communist Party was reinforced, creating a climate where no one was safe, not even from their closest relatives. Anti-Semitism, which had gained strength in the final years of his government, became an even more visible state policy. Soviet Jews were systematically excluded from positions of power, and many academic, cultural, and scientific institutions suffered purges aimed at eliminating supposed disloyal influences. Even the media became instruments to spread messages of mistrust, fostering the perception that betrayal and loyalty were separated by a thread so thin that anyone could fall from grace. Stalin's closest circle lived under his constant watch, aware that any sign of weakness or disagreement could be interpreted as treason. His secretaries, ministers, and high-ranking officers not only feared for their lives, but also learned to anticipate the whims and obsessions of the leader to survive. Meetings were tense and formal, decisions were made under the implicit threat of reprisals, and the atmosphere in the Kremlin was marked by mutual distrust and fierce competition to earn the approval of a man who observed and judged everything without mercy. Even in the international sphere, the influence of his paranoia was evident. Stalin suspected the intentions of both allies and adversaries, interpreting every diplomatic gesture as a possible threat. The Cold War began to take shape already in his final years, and his vision of a constant threat of infiltration and treason decisively influenced Soviet foreign policy, the consolidation of satellite regimes in Eastern Europe, and the way the ideological and military borders of the Soviet bloc were defined. Ultimately, Stalin's final years were marked by consolidated yet fragile and paranoid power, sustained by an apparatus of terror that operated with devastating efficiency. The combination of his physical illness, extreme solitude, and obsession with absolute control turned his final days into a period where distrust and institutional violence intensified to unimaginable extremes, setting the stage for a legacy that would continue to influence the Soviet Union and the world long after his death. On the 1st of March of 1953, Josef Stalin suffered a massive stroke while at his residence in Kuntsevo near Moscow. The severity of the situation was immediately critical. He was left paralyzed, unable to speak or move, totally dependent on those around him. During the first hours after the event, his closest collaborators did not dare to approach immediately. The fear Stalin had cultivated over decades through purges, arrests, and executions made even his most intimate allies afraid to come near, fearing any premature decision or sign of weakness might be grounds for punishment. This delay reveals to what extent Stalin's personal terror had permeated the entire structure of Soviet power. Only hours later, when his condition could no longer be ignored, medical attention was mobilized, but the brain damage was irreversible. During the following days, the dictator remained motionless and silent, while his political circle began to realize that the situation would mark a turning point in Soviet history. Finally, On the 5th of March of 1953, Stalin died, leaving behind an unprecedented power vacuum. The death of the man who had ruled with an iron fist for more than 3 decades did not bring immediate relief. On the contrary, it unleashed a silent struggle for control of the state, with intrigues and tensions among the main leaders of the Communist Party. Meanwhile, the machinery of repression, surveillance networks, and mechanisms of social control continued to operate, reflecting the institutionalization of the terror Stalin had built. The dictator's legacy is profoundly ambivalent. In terms of power and geopolitics, the Soviet Union emerged as an industrial and military superpower, capable of rivaling the United States and projecting its influence over Eastern Europe and the rest of the world. Accelerated industrialization, the development of nuclear weaponry, and victory in the Second World War consolidated its status as a formidable state, respected and feared internationally. However, this success came at a devastating human cost. Political purges, mass executions, induced famines, such as the one in Ukraine in the 30s, and the deportations of entire communities to inhospitable regions claimed the lives of millions of Soviets. The forced labor camps of the Gulag, where millions suffered inhuman conditions, symbolized the price of power consolidation. Beyond statistics, the social and cultural impact of his regime was profound and lasting. Entire families were destroyed, entire communities displaced, and generations grew up in an atmosphere of constant fear, where mistrust became a mode of survival. Repression affected not only political opponents but also intellectuals, artists, and scientists, silencing critical voices and shaping a society where creativity and initiative were subordinated to state surveillance. Stalin's legacy left deep scars in the collective memory of the Soviet Union, creating a country that, despite its power and modernization, carried the weight of decades of systematic terror. Even after his death, Stalin's shadow endured. His personality cult, carefully constructed over decades, continued to influence Soviet politics and culture, while the purges and repressive policies had left behind a structure of control that survived his disappearance. The de-Stalinization later undertaken by Nikita Khrushchev revealed to the world the magnitude of the regime's crimes, but the psychological and social impact of systematic fear and violence would remain for generations. Stalin's balance is therefore a combination of historical achievements and human tragedies, a leader who transformed his nation into a world power, but at a cost that remains one of the darkest and most painful chapters of the 20th century history. The figure of Josef Stalin remained enveloped in a cult of personality that transcended even his death. Monuments, portraits, and statues glorified his image as an infallible leader and protector of the Soviet people, while the horrors of his regime, the purges, the mass deportations, and daily terror, remained buried under layers of official propaganda. Schools, newspapers, cinema, and radio exalted his achievements, glorifying his role in industrialization, in victory over Nazi Germany, and in the consolidation of the Soviet Union as a world power, creating a narrative in which Stalin appeared as the father of the nation and undisputed guide of Soviet socialism. For years, this media construction prevented the population from fully understanding the magnitude of the crimes committed under his government. The families of the victims were forced to remain silent for fear of reprisals, and the memory of millions of the disappeared faded under institutionalized oppression. Prisons remained filled with former inmates, while the bureaucracy and security forces, such as the NKVD and its successors, kept intact many of the control structures Stalin had established. By the late 50s, the de-Stalinization undertaken by Nikita Khrushchev revealed to the world the magnitude of the tyranny that had characterized the dictator's years. During the famous secret report of the 20th Congress of the Communist Party in 1956, Khrushchev denounced the political purges, the false trials, and the summary executions that had eliminated millions of Soviet citizens. The population began to become aware of the overcrowded prisons, the forced labor camps, and the climate of fear and mistrust that had permeated daily life for decades. It was discovered how repressive policy had affected even sectors that should have been considered allies of the regime, and how the combination of paranoia and systematic violence had left a country traumatized and socially and culturally disjointed. Stalin's impact was not limited to the immediate memory of his population. His shadow continued to project itself over Soviet politics, influencing the decisions of later leaders and the consolidation of communist regimes in Eastern Europe. The USSR that survived Stalin was militarily stronger and strategically more solid, but it carried a legacy of institutionalized terror, constant surveillance, and social control that shaped the lives of entire generations. The institutions he had molded to maintain his power did not disappear immediately, and the fear instilled over decades became a lasting trait of Soviet society, hindering full political and social openness even after his death. Stalin's legacy is a reminder of the extremes to which a state can go when absolute power is combined with paranoia, systematic repression, and the deliberate elimination of all opposition. His influence extended beyond his own lifetime, leaving deep scars in the culture, politics, and psyche of the Soviet Union. The consequences of his government affected millions of people, shaped the history of the 20th century, and served as a warning about the dangers of leadership based on absolute control, fear, and institutionalized violence. Ultimately, the world Stalin left behind was one where power and terror coexisted closely, and where the memory of his victims would remain an indelible testimony to the human cost of his reign. Throughout his life, Joseph Stalin built an empire based on fear, surveillance, and repression. He ruled with an iron hand, decided who lived and who died, and transformed the Soviet Union into a superpower at an unimaginable human cost. Millions were deported, imprisoned, or executed. Generations grew up under the shadow of mistrust. Entire peoples were subjected to the absolute control of a leader who knew neither compassion nor restraint. The victory over Hitler consolidated his image as savior of the homeland, but that glory was stained with the blood of his own people. The post-war period brought neither freedom nor relief, but new purges, a resurgence of anti-Semitism, and a silent terror that penetrated every corner of Soviet society. Stalin not only shaped the history of his country, he left an indelible mark on Eastern Europe and on the memory of the 20th century, reminding us that absolute power, when combined with paranoia and systematic violence, becomes a force capable of devastating entire lives and corrupting justice. Today, looking back means facing the reality of a man who, after becoming a hero for some, was the executioner of millions. Stalin's legacy forces us to reflect on the limits of power, the fragility of freedom, and the price humanity can pay when a single individual decides to rule without morality, without justice, and without compassion. In history, his name will remain synonymous with terror, absolute control, and a dark side we must never forget.